Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast today is Darren McGarvey, and Darren is a best-selling author of books called Poverty Safari, and his latest book called The Social Distance Between Us. Darren's also a musician and a rapper, and resides up in Scotland. Darren, it's great to get you on the Godcast. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Good to be with you.
Excellent. Let's do the shameless plugging first, shall we? You've got an events on at the Edinburgh Fringe this year. Just tell us about that.
Cool. Thanks for the opportunity. Usually, if I have a book out, I'll try and line it up with a fringe run, where I sort of get a lot of the themes of the book on their feet in a live setting. So I did this with Poverty Safari in 2018. We managed to sell out a good chunk of the run. So the idea is taking some ideas that from the book that's not necessarily the centerpiece of the book, but expanding them in a kind of in a performance way. So this time around, what I'm trying to do is, given that the theme is of proximity and inclusion, I'm opening myself up to audience interrogation as part of the show. So there's an Ask Me Anything format where audience will be invited to interject at any moment throughout the show. And I've just got to kind of roll with the punches as they come in, while still, attempting to deliver my show and be the main voice.
Yeah.
And obviously pushing back the audience who will be so keen to get in and say their piece. So it starts on the 16th of August to the 21st of August in the Newtown Theatre on George Street, Edinburgh. And it's in the Grand Hall, so it's quite significant for me because it's moving up from the lower hall. This is me getting to play on the same stage as Lemmy or Jerry Sadowitz or Stuart Lee. And so the question is, can I fill it, for 6 nights or even half fill it? So I'm hoping people will come along and help me out.
Well, you're a brave man, Darren, because I've done this Q&A, and I've done it with primary school kids where they like grill the vicar. So I mean, it's so refreshing, but I'm sure you'll get a few curveballs in there as well.
Yeah, definitely. But it keeps you on your toes, doesn't it? And the thing is, you always forget, you can always just have the humility to say, I don't have an opinion on that. I don't know about that. Sometimes we put ourselves under pressure just because we think we have to have an answer for everything. And actually, it's okay just to go, no, that's outside my wheelhouse. Next question.
Yeah. And Darren, people who might not yet be familiar with your books, just I know that you can't really skim over them in a matter of minutes, but just give a brief overview what the crux of your books are about.
I mean, always the themes are around social inequality. So I think the main theme that I've dealt with over the last few years is proximity, and I very formally deal with that in the most recent book. But if you go back to Poverty Safari, it's a more lived experience, subjective analysis of what it's like coming from a working class community and realizing that a lot of the local services and projects are not really set up to truly include you, but rather to set you up to be the recipient of instruction. And in that sense, the minute that you want to actually have some autonomy over what's going on in your local community, you will come up against barriers, and the book examines that, as well as what it's like growing up in an alcoholic home in a community where stress is the #1 trigger for a cascade in health problems and social distance between us. It really takes those themes, but it's more objective, it's more research based, trying to expand the scope from the local of Glasgow to the national of the UK. And also a more comprehensive political analysis in the second part of the book, where we apply the theme of proximity and distance to political ideologies like conservatism, the radical left, centrism, populism. But the first part of the book's looking at, class in a very, what I think is a serious way.
Darren, you touched on growing up in a family where alcohol was an issue. Just tell us what it was like. What was it like growing up in that environment?
It's something that you take as normal when you're there because you don't have a big frame of reference. It was only really when I started visiting other people's homes and taking a temperature in those environments and realizing, oh wow, it's very stressful in my house. I'm on edge all the time. I'm I'm developing all these strategies to try and keep an unpredictable person at bay so that I don't upset them. And all those coping strategies are very useful in the moment, but once the danger subsides and you're in a seat in a mainstream classroom, or you're at a social event, or anything that requires you to just be emotionally normal, it's very difficult to calm yourself down. It's very difficult to settle. And so as you grow and a different level of culpability is placed on you as you become an adult, but you're still emotionally a child, then it sets you up for a lot of failures because you're not well adapted to the social cues expected of you. And this is the same whether it's in education or in work or criminal justice and so on and so forth. So it took me most of my 20s to try and steady the ship as I became all the classic things you associate with trauma and poverty: residentially unstable, mentally precarious, benefit dependent, drug dependent, alcohol dependent, and at the same time within me still having a massive creative urge and a massive desire to be politically engaged and politically active. But these other defects that I had acquired on the way were really holding me back, and I manage that now on a day-to-day basis.
So would you say you've dealt with it now? Are you kind of comfortable with it? You've rationalized it, or is it still?
I've dealt with. I mean, at different points in your life, you make different meaning of what happened, or what your interpretation of what happened. Because obviously, when people talk about trauma or things that happened to them, it's an interpretation of what happened, isn't it? But actually, in truth, I've made many different meanings of my relationship with my mother and my childhood generally as I've grown. So now I'm at the point where I'm not as conclusive, because I know that it evolves. But what I do know now is that a lot of the things that back in the day I thought were intentionally meant to harm me were actually just unhappy accidents that occur when someone is living in the chaos of addiction. Because I myself know what that is like, so I'm able to empathise a bit better.
And as a grown man living through that, Darren, those problems are still there in our estate and urban communities, and also in places of affluence as well, it has to be said. But you know, in terms of social responsibilities, what things really grinding your gears at the moment? What's really pissing you off, for want of a better word?
I'm increasingly upset by the very obvious incompetence of the people who always seem to be lined up to take charge of the most important issues facing a country. And I think this is very particular to Britain, because Britain, in many ways, when you peel back the facade of modernity, it's still rooted to some pretty medieval concepts, you know, hereditary privilege being one, the idea that you can punish people out of addictions or other mental health problems, and this illusion that you get to the top by your own merit. I mean, even Boris Johnson and his was like, and then our wonderful Darwinian system will produce another leader. I mean, that really is a depth of hubris that few humans will ever truly be capable of. He was not a product of a Darwinian system. He was a product of almost Fordist system, which just produces a certain type of leader who is useful for a certain type of establishment. And in no way would Boris Johnson have become Prime Minister if he'd grown up in Pilton rather than educated at Eton. So that upsets me, and I think that the damage that does to discourse, the damage that does to entire communities, when the people who are in charge are incapable of grasping the true depth of problems such as poverty and inequality, then you know, we're in trouble, and it's pretty obvious.
What do you actually think politicians, when we talk about levelling up, what do you think the politicians mean by that? You know, I mean, and I try and be open-minded. I try not to be too vociferous in my feelings towards politicians, although I don't hold them in the highest esteem at the moment. But when they say we've got this levelling up agenda, what to them, what do you think that means?
Well, I mean, at the core of it, what it is politics. So they have to secure a certain demographic in order to be electorally dominant and competitive, and this changes from time to time. So because of Brexit and the fact that working class people were kind of used as a battering ram to secure it, then those working class people, in order for their support to be retained, they have to be furnished with myths of renewal, which is kind of classic politics, but it's particularly cynical coming from a Conservative government of this nature, which for the better part of the last 13 years has taken an axe to every single form of public service that was conceived in the UK. And so I think that's what it really means at the core of it. But then the other aspect, if you were taking it in good faith, would be a recognition that London is its own economic planet, and that its mere existence and the way that it devours everything in its orbit means it's constantly altering the economic topography of the rest of the country, particularly areas that are close to it. So if you go to like Margate and Kent, you know, Kent's the wealthiest place apparently, but if you go to Margate, you find the poorest place. And you've got Londoners fleeing the cost of living crisis that has been going on in London for a long time. And then by virtue of them just moving to Margate, they start pricing out local people. And so you get Conservatives in London, you get Conservatives in Margate, and what they do is they tell local people that this is because of immigrants. They tell local people that this is because of culture war issues. They tell people that this is because of lefties with blue hair, and because of pronouns and all of these things. And then what happens is all those people who should be angry about the economic status quo become angry about these peripheral issues. And that's how the magic trick is done on the right. This kind of culture war just being a kind of new go-to folk devil to distract people from the fact that immigration concern is always rooted in poor governance, and social inequality is always rooted in bad economics. And these are two things for which the Conservative Party is now famed. The only way they can dress it up is because of powerful friends in the media.
Mm-hmm. So Darren, this whole issue of poverty and addiction and abuse, you know, some of my friends who might lean to the right would perhaps say, you know, these people need to help themselves. You know, we already do too much, and we stack them up. I don't believe that to be true. What's your thoughts on that?
That's a conclusion you can only arrive at when you have zero proximity to the issue. And when the issue is constantly being framed by people who have zero proximity to it. I mean, of course, there is a role for personal responsibility, but often what happens is people project their own sense of choice onto everyone around them. So they don't realise that not everyone has those choices or has the ability to perceive those choices that another person is making a judgment from. So really, in a situation like that, I would ask people to try and be a bit more empathetic, because it's very clear from all of the evidence that particular forms of poverty are cyclical, just as particular forms of prosperity are cyclical, and these cannot be attributed to individual decisions or merit all of the time. So whether it's a family that parachute themselves into a good catchment area so that their kids' grades can inflate their house price and their house price can inflate their kids' grades, or whether it's having to go to whatever school's on your doorstep and your kid becoming excluded and what your partner ending up in prison or dead from addiction. We have bubbles of prosperity and bubbles of poverty, and there are political decisions at the root of both of these circumstances.
Yeah. Do you think, you know, one of the things when we featured in the news about these things was the amount of people that rang me up and just said, well, first of all, is it really like this? They kind of, it was almost as though it'd been set up as a you know, hard hitting drama, you know, and then secondly saying, well, we just didn't know it. It surprised me how people genuinely seemed to just not realize that this was what life was like for some people.
I know, and in many ways that's natural in a society that is so divided along class lines. Then one of the unfortunate effects of it is that people are not exposed to how the other half live. And so then they just draw from a reservoir of assumption and are constantly supplied with more myths from media and other people who are equally uninformed. I mean, the situation, if you can just get to the crux of it, the problem we have in the UK right now is that, as you mentioned earlier, the poverty seems to exist no matter who's in power. But of course, there's not a real great difference fundamentally between the two main parties, because the electoral orthodoxy that's produced by a first-past-the-post system and a very liberal environment in terms of media ownership and media propriety means that even a centre-left party has to adopt particular policies in order to become electable. So when you hear politicians talking about public opinion or the British public, what they really mean is the editors and owners of a handful of newspapers who have a strangle-like grip on Britain's curdled public discourse. And that is undeniable. I mean, you just have to look at the history of New Labour and its entire approach, the so-called spin. This was an approach that there was a strategy to deal with that reality. So tap into more affluent voters by adopting more conservative rhetoric and policies, bring in your social justice policies by stealth to keep them out of the papers, and then just fight a daily battle with media in order to try and help people from poorer backgrounds claw a little bit back, while still retaining and enlarging upon the privileges of people who already have enough. Yeah. That's the problem in Britain, if you ask me.
But what's the solution to that, Darren? Because if you've got the right and the centre left not equipped to deal with it, and the country and Westminster, as you know, effectively ruled out Marxism, with Corbyn as the Prime Minister, what is the solution? You know, I'm part of the General Synod of the Church of England, and it just strikes me as an institution that's not fit for purpose. Do you think we've got to that place with our politics?
We need electoral reform. So we need to move. We need to have a more representative, proportionally representative component to the electoral process at UK level, which reflects how it's done everywhere else in the UK. And we need to do away with the House of Lords symbolically, just to detach from this concept of hereditary privilege, and have a second chamber of Parliament, or an advisory chamber of Parliament, that is populated by experts in various fields, politically diverse groups of citizens and community leaders. Let them advise on the legislation that they understand and that's going to affect their lives. You know, with all due respect, and I know not everyone in the House of Lords is a muppet, but at the same time, I mean, the level of privilege in there, even if you're not a hereditary peer, is obscene. £300 a day for what? Sitting around, listening to other people speak. What is the level of expertise that we see in here? So if we want to understand this kind of vertical freefall in political standards and the oncoming social mayhem, as we see a convergence of a collapse in trust in politics, with increasingly wicked, complex social problems and a lack of political leadership to tackle all of this, you just have to look at those main institutions. They're populated by careerists who have grown up in a time where you don't have to have values. You always just think strategically about power. And then when you get power, you don't do anything with it. So really, you know, you have to start getting more fundamental. And I think, you know, when you see the RMT and how Mick Lynch is coming across in the media, you can see that the articulate working class people who are sincere and know what they're talking about are terrifying. They're terrifying for people who are so used to being mollycoddled in a very sterile public debate environment. That somebody just being frank with them with facts is a traumatizing experience, and I would like to see more of that, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, and I suppose you see more of those people at a localized level, Darren. We talked there about the national situation, but kind of what about when you just bring it simply down to a, like a county council or a town council? It troubles me, and I don't think I get myself any favors with this, but we've just recently pedestrianised the town centre. We're tarting up the town hall clock. Meanwhile, 30 yards from my church, there's a drug deal going on, and there's a guy supping a kind of special brew at the bus station at 8 o'clock in the morning. Do you think local government does enough, or do you think what's your view on that?
Local government's been starved of funds because of austerity politics and the economic imperatives of this particular form of economics that both political parties in the UK, the main parties, are kind of wedded to now. And there is no plan for what we do. It's just resignation in the face of less money for less public services, a decline in standards of living, and even Labour now with Keir Starmer, he has to kind of adopt this sort of tempering people's expectations in order to be taken seriously by the electorate. So it's like all that stuff about beverage that he was talking when he first became leader, it's all been binned now because he's adopting that more Blairist approach where actually he's got to seem somewhat serious to Middle Englanders. And so it's about lowering everyone's expectations. And I just think in the current climate, you see it locally, you see the shop fronts, you see the streets, the high streets. It's gambling, it's junk food, it's alcohol sales points, it's charity shops, it's pawn shops. That's your local economy for most small British towns now. That's culturally, that's bereft. Employment wise, that's bereft. But then you travel to a place 1 mile down the road, and you can see the resilience economically where there is wealth in the area. The streets are cleaner. There's public transport links. People feel very involved and included in what is going on. So when you're leveling up, as I say, you have to level up more than just the aesthetics of a place. You need to get into the quantum mechanics of why these economically different places vibrate on different frequencies and get in and deal with it.
I think I don't always offer an opinion, but it's so true is that, Darren. I was walking through my parish with my dogs 2 days ago, and the amount of rubbish, just the lack of pride, it was really quite sad to see, and half a mile up the road, it's a completely different outlook. The landscape's very different. What's what's your biggest fears for the months ahead, Darren? Because I mean, we're food banks are absolutely all over the place, everywhere. Every town's got an issue with addiction and poverty, and now we're going into the autumn and winter where the fuel poverty is going to really bite. Is there I try and be an optimist, but what's your kind of outlook for the next 6 months, Darren?
Well, I actually do feel quite optimistic. I think people are going to get to the end of their tether, and I think for once we actually have some people perfectly placed in British public discourse to be able to direct and channel a lot of that frustration in a positive way. So you even had Martin Lewis, who was talking about civil unrest, and he was talking about civil unrest in a politically organised form, as in mass non-payment of utilities. There's nothing that they can do about that. They can't cut everyone off. And so once the public, if in the event that occurs, begins to get a sense of its power, then that's when you get the scales retipped. And historically, that is what happens in times of crisis, where the powerful suddenly realise there are a whole myriad of options open to them that previously weren't, because their power and dominance is threatened. And economically now, we need to see a rebalancing of the British economy. We need to see this dominance of people who went to elite universities and elite schools chipped away at, because it's not just a question of whether they went to private school or not. It's so glaringly obvious how incompetent and how remote many of these people are from the experiences of a majority of people who live in this country. And you know, there's a real historical basis for keeping an eye on that, because it's dangerous. And we just haven't got to the point where we realise that, yes, we like to hail ourselves as a kind of representative democracy, but we haven't really got to grips with the fact that in a representative democracy which is underpinned by deep social inequality, the people who emerge to represent us are not representative at all. No. And that's a really fundamental issue.
But people, you know, I know people who send kids to private school and say they would probably say they do it because they want the best for their kids. So are you saying that that's not the best for their kids?
No, it's not. It's not in the long run. At the end of the day, when you send someone to a private school, you're denying them the opportunity to mix with other people and become truly cultured and become truly sophisticated. Not just talking in the language of sophistication, not just draping yourself in the veil of being cultured, but actually being able to speak to someone that comes from a different background from you. I mean, it's very interesting how millions of people in this country are constantly being commanded to speak properly. You know, and really what a person who's telling a working class person to speak properly is saying is, can you bend over backwards to accommodate my inferior communication skills? Because I'm so privileged that I can only speak to people who come from the same economic background as me, but I'm the one who gets to walk around pretending to be sophisticated because I go to theatre or because I eat at fancy restaurants. But plot me in a room with people on benefits and I just don't know who I am or what I'm doing.
Yeah,
I mean, it's absurd.
It is absurd. It is absurd. And well, it kind of sets up my next question. I feel that very much being part of the Church of England, in many ways. But do you think the Church, you know, in the United Kingdom has still got a role to play, or is it, or not? I mean, I you know, from my point of view, I'd like to think we do quite a lot for our community and help out and do what we can, but on a wider scale, do you think the church has got a role to play in this?
Oh, yeah, I got that. Yeah, I've just tried to move my laptop a bit. I'm getting quite frustrated with the internet connection. Of course, the church has got a role to play. You know, there are absolutely worthy criticisms of religion, the institutions surrounding it, and you know the kind of stubbornness to reform and modernize that can sometimes lead to controversies and difficulties in communities. But at the same time, from personal experience, I know for a fact that the church is in many ways a first responder to a lot of the social problems that we see. I mean, there are about 200,000 people in Scotland who got sober in church halls. You know, so a church is not just a kind of a place where you receive religious instruction or rhetoric or engage in religious activity, but it's also a community venue, and one, you know, a good church is open to everyone, where rooms are let out for you know, moderate donations or moderate fees, where different groups can access that space and hold their own events in there without any interference from the church. And that's my experience of the church, you know, from a very young age. And I've been involved in some of my most meaningful activism through some of the people that I met who very much come from the church and are part of that ethic, that it's not just about professing you know, a love for God or a reverence for God, but it's about action. It's about what you do, and that being a way to demonstrate your faith or your love for your creator.
Very nicely put, Darren. Thanks. Thank you. Darren, I just want to touch on the music. There were not many Scottish rappers knocking about. No, well, not that I'm aware of. Where did your interest in this genre of music come from?
just came from having music on at home a lot. I mean, my family are all quite musical, and I grew up at a time where, you know, you had, where MTV still played music. It wasn't like just a kind of it wasn't just a reality TV dispensary, you know. So it played music, and hip hop was one of the things that was getting beamed into my house as a teenager. And what I enjoyed about hip hop and rap in particular was it resonated with me, because even though, you know, I come from Britain, I'm white, I've never been in a gang. There was something about the emotional energy of rap music, where people were talking about police, they were talking about poverty, they were talking about their communities being abandoned, and I just related to it and identified with it, but also enjoyed it because it's very literal in its simplest form. You know, it's just fuck the police and that's it, you know, no further explanation required. It conveys a sentiment that people who have come from a certain kind of economic environment understand intuitively. And my love for music and love for hip hop in particular is really what provided me with continuity throughout my adolescence and my 20s, where I was going through a lot of different problems. And to this day, you know, I'm still working on music. I always incorporate music into my live performing, my public speaking, my fringe show. There's a musicality to everything that I do, whether it's obvious or not, and that all comes from that love of rap and hip hop.
Yeah, I think I'm lucky because I have young kids who kind of impart their musical taste on me. But there's lots of strong messages in there that are, you know, obviously the political elite would just kind of bypass it, wouldn't they? Wouldn't connect with it at all. Which artists in particular, Darren, were you influenced by?
The early artists, my friend would bring round artists like Wu-Tang Clan, Gangstar. These may be lesser known to your audience. And then, of course, you had this sort of explosion of Dr. Dre, Eminem at the turn of the millennium, which I think got a lot of people into hip-hop commercially. But I was lucky that I came across a lot of local hip-hop pioneers in Scotland who had been into hip-hop really since it made it to the UK from the States at the beginning of the 80s. And so suddenly I got plugged into a community of people who had been practicing this art form for a long time. And that's when I started rapping in my own accent. And that's when I started making my own music and developing really as an artist.
So Darren, thanks for coming on the Godcast today. Let's just finish off with the show in Edinburgh. Is this, how much of this is scripted, or are you just going to free roll through it and you know, just tell us about that.
I'll have a number of bits, you know. I'll have some poetry, some kind of basically rap without music. I'll maybe do a couple of songs. I'll have some jokes. I like to do a bit of comedy since it is a comedy club, although I don't pitch myself as a comedian because there's less pressure to be funny. But a lot of the comedians have tried rapping to far more disastrous results, so I'm not going to give myself a hard time. But yeah, I mean, people can, the thing about this show is every show will be different every night because I've got that improvisational element to it. So if anyone's interested, come along, and that's including any of your Tory pals. You know, we try to create a welcoming, inclusive environment. You know, as much as I wear my politics on my sleeve, I also do enjoy a bit of debate and a friendly exchange of views. So everybody's welcome.
Good man. Just remind us of the dates again. It's August
16th to the 21st in the Newtown Theatre on George Street in Edinburgh.
Good man. Darren, thanks ever so much for your time, and thanks for coming on the Godcast.
Thank you. Sorry about the connection.